Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my video on magic penetration. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on dispelling the myths associated with magic penetration and magic resistance. Alright, so let's get straight into it, okay? There's going to be a little bit of math, but even if you don't like the math or the theory crafting, there's still going to be a lot of good information that you're going to be able to use for this, okay? So let's start with how MR works, okay? So the way MR works is the amount of damage you take is equal to MR over MR plus 100, okay? So if you have 0, you take 100% damage. You know, if you get up to 210, you take about, I don't know, 30% damage, stuff like this. So the main thing to see from this graph is that, you know, 30 MR is going to do a lot for you when you have no MR. But 30 MR is not going to do very much for you when you already have a lot, all right? MR is best. Magic resistance does the most for you when you have little. And we can connect that next to saying that magic penetration, flat magic penetration, we'll start with flat magic penetration. Magic penetration does the most for the less MR that your opponents have, okay? So let's get into the numbers, okay? So here I have some tables. Every 5 MR, how much damage did they take? We're just gonna assume that we're putting in 100 raw AP damage, okay? So all these numbers and percents are transferable, okay? So you can see, for example, and we're gonna come back to this later, if they have 45 MR, you know, they're gonna take 69% damage, okay? And then down here, these two columns that we have right here, it says two things, okay? This says, okay, if we added 5 magic penetration, so we're going from 45 to 40 in their effective magic resistance, we added 5 magic penetration, we'd gain 2.46 damage approximately. If we added 15 magic penetration, think sorcerer boots or haunting guys, we'd add about 8 damage, okay? So this is going to be very interesting because it's going to show how much damage we gain by getting flat penetration. So of course, exactly what I said down here with the graph, you know, the less magic resistance they have, the more flat magic penetration is going to help us. So you can see here that, you know, you can see that these numbers become smaller and smaller as we go higher and higher MR. Even if, you know, we have a super tank with 400 MR or something, then this 5 magic penetration is going to give you 0.2 extra damage, as opposed to if they only had 5, it would be 4.7. So of course, flat magic penetration, we've always known this, flat magic penetration is much better if they have low resistance. Okay, so here's where the myths start coming in. This is where we start to talk about void staff. Okay, so void staff ignores 35% of the enemy's MR. Okay, and this applies before flat penetration, which is good. So if they have 100 MR, right, and you have void staff, that takes it down to 65 MR. And then say you have haunting guys and sorcerer's shoes, that's another 30, which is going to take it down to 35 MR, okay? So that's kind of how void staff works with flat penetration. All right, so now the misunderstanding is, my enemy team, they have like 200 MR on all their people, you know, they have 300, they have 400, they have so much MR, I should get a void staff because they have that much MR. In fact, that's not actually how it works. The more MR the enemy team has does not necessarily mean the better void staff is for you. Because look at it, we have two things going on right here, and they're going to balance each other out at a sweet spot, which we're going to point out later. That penetration is best the less magic resistance they have, but we're ignoring a percentage of their MR, so the more MR they have, the more MR we're going to ignore. Okay, so then we have this balance as to the sweet spot where void staff is best, all right? And it's probably a little lower than you might think. So let's scroll up down here. We have a very similar table down here showing how much extra damage we do adding the 35%, only adding in that 35% magic resistance. So of course, you know, if they had 0 MR to begin with, then we don't get any extra damage with a void staff, okay, and this makes sense. And then it increases very rapidly, and the maximum is when they have 125 MR. Well, I mean, we're only doing it every 5 MR, but that just to give you an idea, around 125 MR is when Void Staff ignores the most amount of damage. But once you get more MR than that, the MR is not quite as useful. So even though Void Staff is going to be ignoring more and more MR, it doesn't actually help you that much, okay? So ideally, you know, Void Staff is, I guess, ideal when the enemy team is around 125 MR, okay? And then, of course, you don't have to worry about your penetration in these calculations because your flat penetration is going to work after the Void Staff, okay? And then here's the really interesting thing is that we go all the way up to like some super tank with 340 MR, okay? So it's a crazy amount of magic resistance. Maybe it's a Rammus with his W on or something, I don't know. Then the added damage from a Void Staff's passive, the added damage from ignoring 35% of their MR is actually the same as if they only had 45 MR. That's crazy. A target with 340 MR benefits, you benefit from it, the passive of a Void Staff, the same as if they only had 45 MR. Okay? So what does this all kind of mean for percent-based magic penetration and Void Staff? Basically is that it almost doesn't matter how much MR they have. Of course, right, with a small caveat, right, that if you have 40 flat pen, which I very often have with my builds, so that I basically do true damage to the AD carry without any percent base penetration. So a lot of times I'll have 40, of course, then they'll have 5 effective, or the AD carry would have 2 effective true MR, and I wouldn't want to get a Void Staff against that. But the idea is, as long as they have some MR, Void Staff's almost just as good no matter how much they have, okay? And that's a very common, it's very much not known, I feel, in the League of Legends community, okay? And here's the theory crafting behind it, okay? So as long as they have some MR, Void Staff's great. So getting Void Staff is not necessarily, oh my gosh, they have this much magic penetration. It's more of, okay, what champion am I playing? And what are my goals in life? Or not, maybe not in life, but in the game, okay? So for example, if I'm a Lulu, okay, I have great shields and slows and speed ups that all scale on my ability power. Deathcap is a great item for that, you know, and the magic penetration will do extra damage, but you know, if I'm Lulu, maybe that's not exactly what I'm going for, or maybe it is, depends on the game. If I'm someone else like Zyra, if I were to play Zyra, then what that means is that Zyra doesn't really care about AP ratios. Penetration is so useful for her. So no matter how much MR the enemy team has, Void Staff is great. Again, assuming they have some MR. If they have no MR after your flat penetration, then Void Staff's not so useful, but they will, trust me. Against a Zyra, they will almost always have at least like an Aegis or something. So that's kind of that for percent-based and flat-based magic penetration, and how they relate to MR, okay? So the next thing I want to talk about, oh, this is garbage. So the next thing I want to talk about is precision versus piercing thought. So these are 2 mastery talents in the first and second tree that are and that are often brought up when people talk about the difference between Thunderlord's Decree and Deathfire Touch, okay? So here's a small table showing how much MR the enemy has to have for piercing thoughts to be better than precision. And it also shows at every single level as well, because precision gives you increased magic penetration depending on your level actually. And piercing thoughts is just a flat 7% all the time. So basically, you can look at the results for yourself, or if it's too small, I'm also going to be linking a Google Doc spreadsheet of this. You can find the link in the video description. Okay, so down here you can see that we have all these numbers, and the short answer is, for a lot of champions, I really do feel like precision is better, especially as, you know, something like a Zyra, where you really want that extra damage early, that they're not going to have more than 47 MR. No way, no way. Not to mention, remember, flat penetration scales, you know, exponentially well the lower MR they have, and a lot of your early game as Zyra is going to be against targets with very low MR. You're not going to be running into targets with high MR until mid or late game, and that's if the enemy team has a tank, which may or may not even happen, okay? So again, but it's not like better by a huge margin. It's just kind of relatable. But you know, precision is flat. It's going to be better against low MR targets, and piercing thoughts is going to be percent based. It's going to be better against high MR targets as well. Okay, so I think that's mostly it. I might do another theory crafting video later, talking about more of the differences between your different items, like Liandry's, Deathcap, Void Staff, the relationship between all those. Maybe start doing a little bit of theory crafting of Deathfire Touch and Thunderlord's Decree. But actually, that reminds me, there is a good time right now to talk about one of the big differences between Deathfire Touch and Thunderlord's Decree, and it has nothing to do with the AP ratios for me. All right, and it has everything to do with playstyle and what you're getting out of each talent. Some Zyras run Thunderlord's Decree, some Zyras run Deathfire Touch. The idea being that, especially after 6.9, Zyra is much more a damage over time mage and less of a burst mage. You know, Thunderlords is a burst talent. Use 3 skills or an auto attack, you know, and they take this burst, this AoE lightning burst, and it looks really cool, which is honestly one of the reasons why it's more popular. And Deathfire Touch is a damage over time thing. So the biggest problem with Deathfire Touch on Zyra, and I'm getting a little off topic here, but it's an interesting thing to talk about. The biggest problem with Deathfire Touch on Zyra is that she doesn't have any way to actually proc the full Deathfire Touch, as the damage is halved. I believe it's halved. For AoE and damage over time spells, and all of her skills are AoE, and her plants count as damage over time spells. So Zyra doesn't even get the full benefit from Deathfire Touch. She only gets half of the benefit from Deathfire Touch. Furthermore, Deathfire Touch has better AP scaling than Thunderlord's Decree, but Zyra doesn't usually build that much AP anymore. Sometimes as a mid laner you might, but as like top jungle and support, usually you don't have that much AP and you focus more on utility and damage over time. So, and then furthermore, Thunderlord's Decree is just so oppressive in lane. 3 auto attacks on your plant, not even talking about hitting your skills right now. In 6.9, 3 auto attacks on your plant do almost no damage. It has been nerfed, and that's okay. You know, we're gonna have a lot more plants, so I'm not taking issue with that, but it does a lot less damage. But if you add in that Thunderlord's Decree, it makes those 3 plant auto attacks hurt a heck of a lot more, okay? So I think Thunderlord's Decree is almost inarguably better mastery for the laning phase as Zyra, okay? Now, if you're talking about jungle, you can maybe make some more discussions about that. But, of course, Deathfire Touch is almost inarguably better in the late game for Zyra right now, because you are going to be doing a lot of damage over time. You're going to be creating all of these dots all over everybody that you're attacking, and it's going to be taking down, reapplied with every plant attack and stuff like that, whereas Thunderlord's Decree in a late game team fights, you know, it can be useful to help burst down a target, but your burst is not so great. So, I mean, there's that. There's the argument for that. But the short answer is that no matter your AP, well, I mean, it's basically negligible. Thunderlord's Decree is going to be much better in the laning phase. Deathfire Touch is going to be much better in the late game, okay? Okay, so we talked about flat penetration, percent magic penetration, Deathfire Touch, Thunderlord's Decree, precision versus piercing thoughts. I think that's about everything. If you have any questions or things that you want more information about, feel free to leave me a comment in the video description, or you can also ask me on Twitter, on Twitch, or anywhere else I am. Sometimes I'll pop in on Reddit as well. So thank you guys for watching, and may your enemies feel the thorns embrace.